Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. Just a few things to go through before we begin the webinar for today. First of all, it would be great if someone could just let me know that they can hear me. Last week I did a webinar for Written Legal English, and I was speaking for a good 20 minutes before someone said that they can't hear me, and then I realized I turned the microphone off. So if someone could just say hello and say, Simon, we can hear you, then that would make me feel a little bit better. So my name's Simon, I'm from writtenlegalenglish.com, and today we're going to have a look at how to write effective legal English emails. Now, before we begin, there are unfortunately lots and lots of qualifiers. That is to say, what is a legal English email? Well, a legal English email is basically just a normal email. There's unlike letters which follow a particular format depending on the type of letter that you're writing, whether it's a letter to a client, whether it's a memo, or one of the many other different types of letters. Those letters tend to have particular formats or particular styles that you follow, and these and because letter writing has perhaps refined its rules over the last however many years letters have been written, emails are a relatively modern concept, and the effect of that is that there aren't really that many, or there isn't a recognized set of rules about how to write emails, and you can see this very, very quickly and very, very clearly on the internet. If you were to go into Google and you were to type into Google how to write an effective email, then you'll very quickly see that there are many different people, many different authorities giving you lots of different advice about how to write the email. So some people say keep it formal as if you were writing a letter. Some people say emails are informal means of communication and therefore we can use informal language and informal structures in emails. There are people that say emails should be as short as it's possible to be. There are, if I remember correctly, a couple of styles that support this, whether it's the 4-sentence rule or whether it's the 6-sentence rule. The idea is if you can't communicate what you need to say in 4 sentences, then you're saying too much. And then there are people on the other side of the scale saying you should write long emails, you should put in lots of information, etc., etc. So the range of advice as regards how to write an email, really, it's all over the place. There's no one correct way to write an email in terms of how to approach an email. Saying all of that, there is, after looking through a lot of these websites, and this is a presentation that I've given a couple of times before to different people, there are some general rules that you can follow which apply to every single email that you write, with the point of view of thinking about effective communication. How you can write an email and know that what you've written is an effective piece of writing and will get the result that you want to achieve. And those are the rules that I'm going to go through today. And there are only 4 rules for you to have a look at. So let's begin the webinar and you'll see what I'm talking about. Oh, pop myself over here first of all. Okay, so when you're writing an email, let me just move myself. When you're writing an email, there are 4 things that you must include in your email. The first thing is an informative and accurate subject line. Now, the subject line is, some people say, and I tend to agree with this, is the most important element of an email. And the reason why it's the most important element of an email is because this is the first thing generally that people see when an email arrives. So if the subject line is not informative, if the subject line is misleading, then you don't open the email. You might think it's not important, you might think it's not relevant, Simply, people are busy people. If you see something that doesn't immediately spark an interest, or something that doesn't really connect you straight away, you tend to pass over it, and then you don't pay that much attention to it. And of course, if it is an important email, then you've got problems as a result of that. So an informative and accurate subject line is probably the most important thing about the email. But in the body of the email, we need an appropriate salutation and ending. Now, different people feel different ways about appropriate particularly about the salutations and about the endings as well. We'll go into more detail about that, but the salutation is how you address the person that you're writing to, whether it's "Hi Simon," whether it's "Simon," whether it's "Dear Simon," whether it's "Dear Mr. Porter," whatever it might be. The salutation is how you address people. Of course, you've got to include the reason why you are writing. We'll go into more depth about how to do this in the best way. And what do you want to happen? You write an email for a reason. And that reason normally is, not always, sometimes you write an email just to inform someone about something, but generally you write an email to get a response of some kind. And it's the phrasing of this which is really, really important. And in my experience, there are a number of mistakes which are made when people ask for something to happen, but they don't really ask for it in a very, very good way. Or it could be rather an indirect way or an inappropriate way of asking for the things to happen. So these are the 4 rules that I'm going to have a look at today, which will, if you follow these rules and if you work with me through this webinar, then afterwards, hopefully, when you write an email and you bear these rules in mind, you'll write an effective email that will get the result that you need. Okay, just before I begin, let me just move myself over a little bit, just so I don't block up any of the text. There we go, just pop myself over there. Okay, so let's begin. Subject lines. Subject lines must be informative and accurate. They must get straight to the point, and there's no room in the subject line for any waffle, for any other noise. Simply say in the subject line what it is that you want, what the email is about, and make sure that when you're writing the subject line, it's got to be accurate. There's no point, or certainly you'll lose a lot of trust in the person who receives the email if you write an email, a subject line, which isn't accurate. And also, if the subject line isn't accurate and in fact the person reads that subject line and doesn't open the email because the subject line isn't accurate, well, that's the fault not of the recipient, not of the person reading the email, but of the person who sent the email. And the subject line must get the reader's attention immediately. So if you write a subject line which is very vague and it's not exact, then you tend to pass over those emails. If you write a subject line which doesn't have a particular target in mind, and you'll know the kind of things that I'm talking about. I'm sure for the people who receive many emails every single day, they select the emails they open based on the way that the subject line is written. And there's a few little qualifiers about this, but let me just go through a few examples of what are bad subject lines and what are good subject lines. Bad examples would be subject lines such as meeting or the merger. These tell us nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's nothing in this subject line that makes me want to open up the email. I don't know what's going on. I don't know who's involved. I don't know how important it is for me. I'm a busy person, don't have much time. Why should I open up this email? And there's no point contacting me in 2 hours' time saying, why didn't you have a look at my email? It's because the subject line didn't tell me that I should open up the email. Why should I open up an email that just says meeting? Why should I open up an email that just says the merger? I do, as I'm sure within the area of law, many mergers, many things are happening at the same time, multiple meetings going on. So a one-word subject line like this isn't really any good to anyone. So what would be a better alternative? Better alternatives would be details. So meeting, but not just meeting, but the name of the meeting, the time of the meeting, the day of the meeting, with who. So you could say meeting regarding XXX, 8 o'clock Monday with our new client, for example, something like this. Now, the subject line is around about, let's say, 15 to 20 words long. But people generally can deal with information up to about 25 words. So if you see a subject line come in with about, let's say, about 10 to 15 words on it, you can generally process that within about 1 to 2 seconds. And in that 1 to 2 seconds, you'll quickly see what the email is about based on the subject line. And that is the key to a good subject line. You can tell what the email is going to be about. You've got a great idea of what it's going to be about based on a 1 or 2 second review of the subject line. Secondly, the merger. When the merger is, the parties to the merger, the issues involved. So if there's a particular issue that the email is about regarding the merger, for example, what a party has pulled out, or a delay or a postponement, or a change of details, or negotiations, or whatever it might be, then the subject line is a great place to put that information to catch my attention and make sure I know what the email is about before I jump into the email. So it's not difficult to write a great subject line. It's not difficult to write a subject line which catches the reader's attention and gets the reader to open your email in order to respond to what it is, or in order to be aware of what it is that you're trying to communicate. I heard a wonderful anecdote of in the company's practice, that people were sending emails, and because there were so many emails being sent, that emails were being overlooked. And I would argue that this is because the subject line wasn't very well written. So people got into the habit of prefixing the subject line with urgent. So they would write urgent meeting ... And the idea is that you would write urgent, presumably in capital letters, in order to get the attention of the reader. So the reader would look urgent, and then they would open up the email. But the problem was, in this particular company, that everyone started to write urgent. So then, of course, urgent didn't become urgent anymore, because everyone was writing urgent, and so everyone didn't react to urgent. So then someone came up with the wonderful idea of writing urgent, or doubly urgent, or something along those lines. And in order to highlight the fact that this really was urgent, well, you can see where this is going. This is not the appropriate way to communicate urgency in an email. If you want someone to open up your email, and you need that to happen quickly, the subject line and the way that you write the subject line is the key to that. If you don't write a good, effective, powerful subject line, if you don't include information, and don't be afraid of writing a subject line which is about, as I said, up to about 20 words long. There's nothing wrong at all. There's no right or wrong with this. In fact, it's better to include as much information as long as it's relevant and as long as it's accurate as possible. So overusing urgent, putting in asterisks, putting in capital letters, putting in other tools to make sure that someone opens up your email is not the way to go about it. Writing an effective subject line is. Now, there is a modern tendency, I've seen it more and more, and I'm guilty of this as well, and this is also something that people either like or don't mind, or they hate. And that is when you use the subject line to communicate the message of the email. And what happens is you write the message in the subject line up to 20 words, almost as if it was like an SMS or a text being sent by phone. and you leave the body of the email completely blank. Now, this is a relatively modern thing, as I said. The question is, you would have to ask yourself, is this an appropriate way of communicating information? And this will have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. I would within the legal context, I would recommend not writing like this to clients in a law firm. If you're of a law firm, if you're thinking about hierarchy, I would perhaps argue that if the hierarchy is going up, it's better not to write these kind of emails to your bosses, senior lawyers, partners, etc., etc. However, if there is a corporate culture in place, a firm's culture in place, where this is allowed for or this is accepted, then fine, that's fair enough. But I would ask you to think carefully about this on a case-by-case basis, whether this is an appropriate way of communicating an email. Certainly it's effective, and you could argue this is using the subject line effectively, and you wouldn't be wrong. But then there's the question of appropriateness in communicating in this way. Well, I'll leave that decision up to you. So point number one, the subject line is probably the most important element of an email. If you don't get a good subject line, then people are not going to open up your email. As simple as that. Point number two, salutation and ending. And here we come to this area where some people will agree, some people will disagree, some people will say do this, some people will say do that. There are many different approaches to how you do the salutation and the ending, and of course there are cultural issues in terms of corporate culture, in terms of country culture, international country cultures, about how you do this, and of course not forgetting personal preference. So let's have a look at what would be the general rules before we go into all of the possibilities with this. So first of all, the general rules are as follows. If you know who you are writing to, use their name. So for men, and assuming that this is formal contact, for men, use Mr. or Doctor or Professor or whatever it might be. For women, use Ms, pronounced MZ, written MS. That's if you don't know if you don't know the marital status. If you know the marital status of the woman that you're writing to, then use Miss or Mrs. Although, as I see more and more often nowadays, the standard is simply just to say Ms and just leave it as that. And if you're writing to someone, and once again, this is from the formal point of view, if you're writing to someone and you know who you are writing to, then you end the email with yours sincerely. Now, this is a British English rule. American English rule slightly differs. American English would say that you would prefer sincerely yours or even sincerely. I've written here not sincerely because I don't like it, personal preference. So I prefer yours sincerely. But of course, the decision would be up to you. If you're working in a company with an American corporate culture, then follow the rules as suggested by that corporate culture. Otherwise, if you know who you're writing to, use the ending yours sincerely or sincerely yours. However, people say that emails are informal by nature. I wouldn't necessarily 100% agree with that, but certainly there is a common trend to write, to end an email with best regards or kind regards if you know who you're writing to. I would advise against the abbreviated forms BR or KR. I'm never a huge fan of these, to be honest. Once again, this is an example of how endings are completely subjective, or people's approach to the endings are completely subjective. I don't like receiving an email which says BR or KR. So for me, I think it looks lazy. I don't think it looks professional. I think if you can't be bothered to write out best regards or kind regards, then it doesn't really leave a good impression with me. Similarly, talking about salutations, I prefer some kind of, and the other way around, I really, really dislike it when someone writes me an email and just says, Simon. For me, this starts off the email automatically in a negative tone of voice. If you say Simon in an official way like that, it sounds as if I've done something wrong straight away. If you say Dear Simon, Hi Simon, then straight away there's a lightness, there's a happiness, there's a kindness to that email. But if you just say Simon, then straight away I think that I've done something wrong, and it makes me approach your email in perhaps a slightly more negative way than otherwise. So I would always advise starting off the salutation with if you know the person, and if the contact is at that level where you don't need to say Mr. or Mrs., if you can say and you're on first names, then I would advise starting off with Dear, whoever it is, or Hi, whoever it is, and not just Simon or Barbara or Tony or whatever it might be. For me, once again, personal preference, I'm not a fan of this, but there are people out there who are not bothered by that. But but there are general rules with how to write salutations, and these are as I've just presented. Now, if you don't know who you are writing to, then the general rule is to say Dear Sir or Madam. Dear Sir or Madam. And if you don't know who you're writing to, you have to end the email with yours faithfully. This is standard letter writing convention, and it also applies to emails. It's not great. First of all, when you're writing an email in today's world, the argument suggests you really should know who you're writing to. There's not much excuse to not know who you're writing to in today's world. If you do a Google search, LinkedIn search, I'm pretty sure it's not too difficult to find out who it is that you're writing to. So some people are against the use of Dear Sir, Madam on the basis that you're too lazy to find out who it is that you wrote to. Now, I don't entirely agree with that, but this is the kind of thing that you'll read on the internet if you look for guides on how to write emails. So if you can, find out who you're writing to, and once you do that, then you can use yours sincerely or best regards. If you don't know who you're writing to, Dear Sir, Madam, and end the email with yours faithfully. Many people overlook this because they see this as artificial, and I would agree to a certain extent it is artificial, but you need to include this in every single email, and that is a good finisher. So offering assistance and help if required. As I said, it's a standard requirement, it's polite, it's courteous, it might never be used, but nevertheless it's one of these things that you've got to put in at the end of your email. So if you've got any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to get back in contact with me, something along those lines, and then at least it gives you the person that you're writing to an avenue to get back in contact with you if they've got any questions. And that is salutations and endings. So general rules, open to personal preference. Find out, it's always a good idea to find out what the rules are of the company that you're working in, to see if there is a particular writing style as regards salutation and endings, or whether you can choose whatever it is that you like. There is a general rule of thumb if you're opening contact with someone that you haven't written to before, to start off in a formal way, and then when that person responds, to continue in the way that that person responds. So to give you an example, so if I'm writing to someone that I don't know, then I would say, Dear Mr. Brown. And if Mr. Brown writes back to me and says, Hi Simon, then the general rule of thumb is to continue that level of register, that level of formality. because then you're giving the person that you're writing to the ability or the possibility to set the rule on the level of formality or the level of register. And you should respond in kind. If you write "Dear Mr. Brown" and they write back and they say "Dear Mr. Porter," then those are the rules. And then maybe after time, if there's a continuing email exchange backwards and forwards, then perhaps it would get a little bit more informal. But always respond in the same way that to the person who writes you an email if you start the email exchange. Now, there might be the situation where emails are being sent backwards and forwards very, very quickly, almost as if you're having an email conversation of some kind. In that case, certainly in my experience, the rule tends to be that you don't need to include salutations and endings in that circumstance. So I send an email to someone, they respond back within, let's say, 30 seconds. I respond to them in another 30 seconds. So it's as if we're having a conversation. At that point, if that's the situation, if that's what the email is doing, then I don't see the need at that point to include salutations and endings until you get to the final email in the exchange, and then you can sign it off with an appropriate ending. So that's just the application of common sense. Saying that, as I just said, you have to respond in the way, you have to follow the person's lead who's responding to you. So even if there is an email exchange and that person still is using salutations and endings, then follow the lead and use salutations and endings. But if that email exchange continues without salutations and endings, then to go ahead and use that format. The third thing to remember when you're writing emails: why are you writing? Sounds really obvious, doesn't it? But you'll be surprised. The problem with emails is that people think about or approach emails in a slightly different way to the way they approach letters. When you're writing a letter, in an ideal world, you plan the letter, you think about what you're going to say, you structure the letter, and then you begin the process of writing the letter, and then you maybe do a redraft or several redrafts before you come up with the final letter. And this would be the process with writing memos or other legal documents. Emails happen a lot faster than letters, so people don't go through the same analytical process of planning an email. And so it very often happens that you write an email quickly, very often without thinking, which is why emails are really, really important from my point of view as a proofreader and as a teacher, because this is where most of the mistakes happen. So when I work with people in the past and they send me letters and they send me memos, they're interesting from one point of view, but they're not interesting from the other point of view, and that is that when you're writing something, you tend to think, a letter or a memo, you tend to think about it and go into some detail, and there's a revision process, as I said. With emails, people just tend to write and they send, and that's where most of the mistakes are, and that's why I want to have a look at the emails, and particularly the short emails. For the emails which are one or two paragraphs or one or two lines, there tends to be an amazing amount of mistakes that you can make in a couple of lines. And this isn't just for non-natives, this would be applicable also to natives as well. When you're not thinking about what you're doing, you tend to make mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes, and these are the 2 points that we're going to have a look at now, the first one is, why are you writing? When you write an email, generally it's a good idea to tell the person why you're writing. What's the basic message you're trying to communicate? This should be the first line, or certainly at least in the first paragraph of your email. And it could be something as simple as, "Dear Jim, I'm writing because," or "I'm writing to," or something along those lines. Tell the person what it is that you're writing. Now, everyone's had the experience, I'm sure, of receiving an email, and you read the email and there's a couple of questions that go through your mind. First of all, what does this person want? We'll get to that in a second. What does this person want, and what do I do? And the reason why you have those questions is because the email hasn't been written very well, and the email hasn't been written with this question in mind. Why are you writing? Get this information into the first sentence, or get it into the first paragraph, and give the reader no doubt what it is, or why you're writing. For what are you trying to achieve? Include what's necessary in the email to achieve your goal. No more, no less. So in other words, stick to the point. Don't go waffling on and on and on. Don't go including lots of different information into the email that you think might be necessary. Just keep the body of the email, just keep it on track. Keep it, write the email in a way that you want just the bare necessities, if you will, for the person to read the email, understand what's going on, and react. And one way we can do this, of course, is to remember the sentence rules that I presented in the video a week or two ago. Keep 1 point per sentence, or if you're writing, if you're using sentences with 2 clauses, for example, conditional clauses, 1 point per clause, a maximum of 2 clauses per sentence. Keep the sentences nice and simple, nice and straightforward, active voice, and communicate why you're writing the email. Now, that's one point of information that's often missing from emails. The second one is, what do you want to happen? So you're writing the email to say why you're writing the email, but almost always you want the person that you're writing to do something. What do you want to happen? And there is a very, very simple way to request people to do something. We have a wonderful form in English for this by using questions, or by using directions. And normally we would use the indirect voice to do this. So, could you please send? Can I ask you to? Would it be possible for you to? Etc., etc. If you're not familiar with indirect question forms, then I would suggest you get on to Google quickly, type in indirect question forms into Google, and you'll know what it is, but the structures are important. And the structures are important because, first of all, it's a clear question. You're saying, I want you to do this, or can you do this, sorry, but you're saying that in a polite and appropriate way. If you're using direct questions, do this, send me, write this, then in English these come across as quite rude, and of course they might have the effect of upsetting the reader of the email. So use indirect question forms to request, or indirect forms to direct people to do different things. So for example, can I ask you to ... Now, there's lots of different ways to communicate politeness in English, and indirect question forms is a fantastic way to ask someone in a polite way. I have seen, however, plenty of examples of the use of kindly. Now, I am not a fan of kindly, for a number of reasons. First of all, it's rather archaic. It's a little bit old-fashioned. Not many people, certainly not native speakers, don't use kindly that much. I've seen, certainly the trend in Poland is to use kindly quite a lot. I couldn't tell you about other countries, but kindly is seen as a polite form in English, and it's, in my opinion, overused. So not only is there the problem of it being archaic, the second problem is that lots of people use it incorrectly. And I'll give you some examples. I am kindly sending you an invoice for payment. Now, kindly is an adverb, and adverbs modify verbs. So what you're doing here is you're modifying the verb sending by putting kindly before it. So from a pure grammatical point of view, how are you sending the invoice for payment? I am sending the invoice for payment in a kind manner. This, of course, makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And it wouldn't have a particularly positive effect on the reader either. Why the reader gets an invoice, the invoice has to be paid. Why should the person who pays the invoice think about this being sent in a kind manner or not? It makes no difference to the person paying the invoice. So this use of kindly as regards your actions can often be misused. So if we were to look at this from the other point of view, if we were going to ask, if we wanted to use kindly from the and think about the actions of the reader, then we might come up with a sentence like this. Could you kindly pay the invoice as soon as possible? Even this sentence, although it's better because what you're asking someone to do is for them to do something as quickly as possible, it still seems rather unnecessary in this context. Could you pay the invoice as soon as possible? So without kindly, is still formal. It's still polite. It's indirect. It's a clear question. We don't need to say kindly. And of course, that it's the use of kindly, or the positioning of kindly here, is open to interpretation as well, because you could, of course, interpret this sentence correctly, which means about the speed at which it's done. But someone, if they were being particularly pedantic, would say, "Why do I have to pay this kindly? I don't really want to pay the invoice at all. So the use of kindly here is also something that I would question. I kindly ask you to pay the invoice as soon as possible. If we're thinking about our own actions and using kindly correctly, we could use this structure. I kindly ask you to pay the invoice as soon as possible. But once again, I would question the sense of this. If you use an indirect question form, could you kindly, or could you ... would it be possible for you to do ... It's more than enough. We don't need to use kindly to communicate politeness. Very often it has the negative effect, and very often it's misused. So my advice would be to not use kindly. There are other ways of improperly asking questions, and the reason why these are improper ways to ask questions is because you're not really asking a question. What you're doing is you're suggesting something, but you're suggesting something in not a very clear way. And if the reader gets a suggestion, well, a suggestion isn't a question, and a suggestion isn't a direction. So the reader could receive your email and say, well, you didn't tell me to do this. And the reader would be absolutely correct, because you didn't use a question or an overt or an obvious question in order to get the person to respond. What do I mean? Well, have a look at these examples. I would appreciate it if. Now, I'm really not a huge fan of this. I would appreciate it if. This means, or this has the effect of meaning, I want you to help me. I want you to do me a favour. Now, in some contexts, that could be absolutely fine. But in other contexts, for example, paying the invoice, I would appreciate it if you could pay this invoice. In other words, I want you to help me by paying this invoice, or I want you to do me a favour by paying this invoice. This is not an appropriate question. This is not an appropriate direction. When you're asking someone to do something, you have to do it in a clear, and you want that thing to happen. You have to do it in a clear and an obvious way. And hiding behind a non-question, which is what this structure does, is not a good way to communicate clear questions or clear direction. I'm not a huge fan of "I would appreciate it if." Every time I try to correct this with someone, I meet resistance. People always say to me, "But this is what people say." And I always respond to them saying, "So if someone else does it wrong, do you have to do it wrong as well? Or if someone else does it incorrectly, do you have to do it incorrectly as well?" Of course, you could use the opportunity to set the standard and to say something correctly. I'm not a huge fan of "I would appreciate it if." As I said, there are contexts which it is correct, where you do need help and you do need a favour, in which case there's not a problem. But generally speaking, you write in a way that you want someone to do something, and "I would appreciate it if" is not the structure to use in that case. "May I remind you that the payments are overdue?" What is this? This isn't a question. This isn't a call to action. This isn't "I need you to do something." This is just a statement that you hope I understand what it is that you're trying to say. In other words, you're writing this sentence in the hope that I see the action that needs to be done. This isn't obvious, or rather it might be obvious, but it's easy to ignore because it's not a clear question. If I received an email that said, "May I remind you that the payments are overdue," I could ignore that email and then wait for the person to get in contact with me, and that person would say, why didn't you make the payments? And I could quite legitimately say, "Because you didn't ask me to." Because this isn't a question. This isn't a direction. This is a statement of fact. And statements of fact do not generate responses in a very efficient way. So if you write something like this and you hope that someone will see the question, this is really poor communication, and I would advise you not to do that. Once again, use an indirect question form precisely and clearly to get the effect that you want. Similarly, "So far we haven't received payment." Where's the question? What do you want me to do? I know what you think I should do, but if you haven't asked me a question, why should I do that? Please find the details of our bank account below. Once again, I can see what it is that you're trying to ask me to do, but you haven't asked me a question. What should I do with this? Should I send you the money? Well, obviously you want me to send me the money, but you haven't asked me in a very direct way or a very obvious way, so I can ignore that one. For me, it's not so much of an important issue. So these are four examples of non-questions that people, or these structures which people use in order to get other people to do something. But as I said, these are not very effective ways of communication. Now, the last one is something I've seen a lot, and this is an issue that I fight with people most about, because it seems to be the fashion, let's say, to write this at the end of the email. But I consider this to be extremely lazy and an extremely poor way of communicating, particularly if you're asking questions. So I could write a situation, a complex situation above. This happened, this happened, this happened, and then at the end I would just say, "Please advise." Advise on what? What is it exactly that you want me to do? I haven't got any clear instructions. I don't know what part of the situation you want me to respond to. Where do I go with this? Why should I waste half an hour or an hour of my time responding to your request, if I can call it that, and waste my time? If I respond to something which you don't want, well, I've wasted my time, you don't get what you want, and that doesn't exactly build a great relationship between the people who are communicating by email. So "please advise" is an incredibly lazy, ineffective way of asking someone to do something. If you've got a situation, whatever that situation might be, then at least you should take the time to communicate the call to action, what you want to happen, using clear questions or directions, using indirect question form, and use that indirect question form to be specific. Could you please tell me about this, or explain this situation in more detail, particularly ... Could you please send me pay the invoice by tomorrow lunchtime at the latest? Specific pieces of information that I can respond to, but more importantly, that you can follow up on. So if you write a question and direction clearly, in a way that can't be ignored, that in a way that can't be misinterpreted, then you've protected yourself. You've defended yourself against any future problems, because you can quite clearly show the email, and you can see you can explain, I quite clearly said I need this to happen. You can see the question, and then there's really no argument. But if you have that discussion and you say, I wrote, may I remind you that the payments are overdue, then this is a pretty a weak basis to defend your position that you asked someone to do something. So this is really why indirect question forms, as regards what you want to happen, are so important. Okay, so let's just move back quickly, all the way back to the beginning, because I didn't prepare the last slide. So by way of recap, things that you must include: an informative and accurate subject line. If you don't, few people are going to open up your email. An appropriate salutation and ending. This comes down to personal preference or corporate style, but if you get this wrong, then you can end up upsetting someone. The reason why you are writing. Explain quickly. I'm writing because, or I'm writing in response to. Whatever it is, get it into the first sentence, or the first paragraph at least, and make it clear. There has to be a reason why you're writing the email, and communicate that to the person who will hopefully read your email. And then lastly, explain very clearly, politely, formally, using indirect question forms, what is it that you want to happen. And if you do that, if you include all of those 4 elements in your emails, you then start to write effective emails which get responses. Okay, well, thank you very much for following me today watching this webinar. If you have any questions at all about what I said, or about indirect question forms, or if you disagree with anything that I said, or want more clarification about anything that I said, then please leave a comment below this video, or leave a message on my Facebook page or YouTube channel, and I'll get back in contact with you. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll be back with another webinar soon.